With all your love for truth, you have forced yourselves so long, so persistently, and with such hypnotic rigidity to see nature falsely, that is to say, stoically, that you are no longer able to see it otherwise. This famous quote is an excerpt from section 9 of Friedrich Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. The full quote is often mentioned when discussing Nietzsche's relationship with the Stoics. While it is definitely true that Nietzsche did have some problems with the Stoic philosophy, the truth is more nuanced than the simple assertion that Nietzsche hated the Stoics, or that he was an anti-Stoic. In this video, we'll explore both Nietzsche's points of critique and the ways in which he actually admires Stoicism. Hopefully, this will lead to a more solid understanding of both Nietzsche and the Stoic philosophy. Part 1. Nietzsche versus the Stoics. Maybe you have watched our series dedicated to Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. In that case, you probably already know why Nietzsche would be critical of Stoicism. The big, overarching theme in Nietzsche's philosophy is the affirmation of life in all of its aspects, both the good and the bad. This is the core of the Nietzschean phrase amor fati, or love of fate. Nietzsche's challenge is for us to embrace this world, this life, this fate. He wants us to go against Christianity with its focus on heaven or the afterlife, and also against Schopenhauer with his ethics of resignation and asceticism. Christianity and Schopenhauer both deny the material world. In Christianity, this life, this world, is just a preparation for the afterlife. And in Schopenhauer, this world is evil to the core and should be discarded, turned away from. The Stoics, according to Nietzsche, suffer from a similar malady. The Stoics want us to be indifferent to nature, which is to say, indifferent to life. This Stoic indifference to life tends to be forgotten in the 21st century, where we like to use Stoicism as some kind of self-improvement philosophy, taking what is useful and discarding what is not, like picking and choosing at a buffet. But some passages in the classic Stoic works are shocking to the modern mind. For example, let's read section 3 of the Enchiridion, the famous book by Epictetus. With regard to whatever objects give you delight, are useful, or are deeply loved, remember to tell yourself of what general nature they are, beginning from the most insignificant things. If, for example, you are fond of a specific ceramic cup, remind yourself that it is only ceramic cups in general of which you are fond. Then, if it breaks, you will not be disturbed. If you kiss your child or your wife, say that you only kiss things which are human, and thus you will not be disturbed if either of them dies. Do not be disturbed if either your wife or your child dies. Is this really a philosophy worthy of emulation? Nietzsche would certainly say no. Imagine to yourselves indifference as a power. How could you live in accordance with such indifference? To live, is not that just endeavoring to be otherwise than this nature? Is not living valuing, preferring, being unjust, being limited, endeavoring to be different? In fact, Nietzsche would recommend the total opposite. Embrace life in all its aspects, both good and bad. Life is full of sorrow and also full of joy, full of highs and full of lows. The Stoic seeks to blunt his passions and emotions and remain at a neutral baseline, neither high nor low. In doing so, the Stoic is making the same mistake as the Christian and as Schopenhauer have made. Both do they deny the world. They deny life. They operate from the same basic assumption that life is evil or that existence is suffering. And, following that they need a way out. Nietzsche's second point of critique is more theoretical in nature. He is accusing the Stoics of having the same bias as other philosophers. Namely, they do not have a will to truth, but they have a will to power. With all your love for truth, you have forced yourselves so long, so persistently, and with such hypnotic rigidity to see nature falsely, that is to say, stoically, that you are no longer able to see it otherwise. And to crown all, some unfathomable superciliousness gives you the bedlamite hope that because you are able to tyrannize over yourselves, Stoicism is self-tyranny, nature will also allow herself to be tyrannized over. Is not the Stoic a part of nature? But this is an old and everlasting story. What happened in old times with the Stoics still happens today. As soon as ever a philosophy begins to believe in itself, it always creates the world in its own image. It cannot do otherwise. Philosophy is this tyrannical impulse itself, the most spiritual will to power, the will to creation of the world, the will to the causa prima. Nietzsche is accusing the Stoics of creating the world in their own image, the age-old bias of the philosopher. He accuses Kant, Descartes, Schopenhauer, and Christianity as a whole of doing the same thing, each in their own unique way. If you want a more in-depth look at this, we recommend you watch our 3-part series on Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. Now that we have seen what Nietzsche's problem is with Stoicism, let's take a look at what could possibly redeem it. Part 2. Nietzsche and the Stoics. Interestingly, while Nietzsche seems to hold the Stoic philosophy in contempt as a whole, he speaks approvingly of individual Stoics. For example, in Daybreak, one of Nietzsche's lesser-known works, we read the following passage. Epictetus was a slave. His ideal man is without any particular rank and may exist in any grade of society. But above all, he is to be sought in the deepest and lowest social classes, as the silent and self-sufficient man in the midst of a general state of servitude, a man who defends himself alone against the outer world, and is constantly living in a state of the highest fortitude. He is distinguished from the Christian especially, because the latter lives in hope in the promise of unspeakable glory, permits presents to be made to him, and expects and accepts the best things from divine love and grace, and not from himself. Epictetus, on the other hand, neither hopes nor allows his best treasure to be given him. He possesses it already, holds it bravely in his hand, and defies the world to take it away from him. Christianity was devised for another class of ancient slaves, for those who had a weak will and weak reason, that is to say, for the majority of slaves. In this passage, we see some kind of nuance in Nietzsche's view on the Stoics. To be clear, he still views Stoicism as a slave morality just like Christianity. Epictetus was a slave, the strong kind of slave, but a slave nonetheless. A slave in a very literal sense even. Yet there is something heroic in the attitude of this slave. Defiantly he makes his stand against the world. The main difference between Stoicism and Christianity is that in Stoicism, the material world is the only world there is, whereas in Christianity, the focus is on another world, the afterlife. At least the Stoic is honest enough to admit his lot in life, and he doesn't delude himself with tales of, oh, it will be better in the afterlife. He takes on his task with heroism and courage, and not self-delusion. This strong slave is self-sufficient and alone against the outer world. For men living in trying times, Nietzsche even recommends Stoicism. Stoicism may be quite advisable for men with whom fate improvises, for those who live in violent times and are dependent on abrupt and changeable individuals. So, all in all, it's very doubtful to say Nietzsche is a complete anti-Stoic or that Nietzsche hates the Stoics. There is a place for Stoicism in Nietzsche's worldview. The Stoic attitude is one that can help someone through violent, uncertain times. Regardless of whether the philosophy is correct, it certainly is useful. But only if the times are bad. And this is a final word of caution. Epictetus was a literal slave in ancient Greece. Is our modern, 21st century life really comparably bad? Are we suffering as much as Epictetus has? I'll leave that for you to decide. Is our life really painful and burdensome enough for us to exchange it with advantage for a stoical mode of living and stoical petrification? We do not feel sufficiently miserable to have to feel ill in the stoical fashion.